Greetings. Happy Earth Week to everybody. And although it's belated, happy Indigenous Peoples Day, also known as Columbus Day. And that was last Monday. Thanks for stopping in to check out this short video on some research in progress and hopefully shortly into publication. My name is Warren Church. I serve in our Earth and Space Science department as an anthropologist. Why is an anthropologist in a department of Earth and Space Science, you might ask? I'm particularly interested in human interactions with the environment, and I teach both anthropology and environmental science here at Columbus University, Columbus State University, of course. When I'm not teaching here at CSU, I do archaeological research in South America, I do field work in Peru, but I also enjoy doing early colonial period research that is historical. And I enjoy doing research continent-wide, not only in the Andes and Peru. I would like to spend a short period of time describing my current research in Peru with you. Presently, I'm engaged in research, actually a critical analysis of a fascinating popular narrative that has emerged during the past 10 years about European colonization following the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, after he sailed the ocean blue. The topic has elements of tragedy for indigenous peoples of the Americas, which is why I felt it appropriate to salute them at the beginning of this segment. The research is also about climate change, not the global warming that concerns scientists and should concern you right now, but about global cooling in a period lasting a few centuries and 1 century of severe cooling in particular. And it's commonly called the Little Ice Age. That period in particular is a century in the mid 1500s to the mid 1600s. And I would, let's charge right in. The name of this presentation was the Little Ice Age caused by New World pandemics unleashed during European conquest, and the subtitle, Questioning a Popular Narrative from a South American Perspective. That subtitle is just a little different from the one that was posted, but represents, I think, what we're doing here, at least for this presentation. What was the Little Ice Age? Sometimes for shorthand, we say LIA. It was a global cold period, worldwide, and it lasted for the most generous estimates about 600 years, between 1300 and 1900 CE. Essentially is what we use instead of AD nowadays. The temperature seemed to have lowered on average about 2 degrees Celsius. That would be 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. May not seem like a great deal, but it was. It was a time of actually great suffering just because of cold temperatures. Things became frozen, bodies of water that were not typically frozen during wintertime. The coldest period that's been documented is between 1570 and 1680, just a century plus 10 years. And the time period here, the long time, a lot went on between 1300 and 1900. And especially during this time, 1570 to 1680, it seems to be a deepening of this cold spell at its coldest, and is also marked by corresponding rapid social, economic, political changes in Europe and worldwide. Now, if you look at that and say broaden it to a more generous estimate, we're looking at the Enlightenment. We're thinking about a time when feudalism broke down, a time of, again, great economic change, a time of economic expansion, of trade around the world. There's a book written about it, which was reviewed here in the New Yorker, and on the upper right you see this page from it, How the Little Ice Age Changed History. So it was certainly consequential. The causes proposed for the Little Ice Age: heightened sunspot activities, increased volcanic activity, which is, recall that this is a historically documented time, and so these changes are all historically documented by different writers and observers. You can see on the right that deepening of the temperatures there and it's over here. You can see around, say, right after 1600. In fact, 1610 is the coldest in time, and I'll show you how we get these records. But an interesting cause proposed for the LIA, which has recently become actually news as of last year, was human population collapse. Population collapse in the Americas after 1492. This is a period of time which was termed the Great Dying in 1982 by anthropologist Eric Wolf, and has been adopted by some geographers and climate scientists to refer to this period of massive demographic collapse in the Americas. Enormous numbers of Native Americans died. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. Let's think about this Great Dying and the Little Ice Age first by talking about the Little Ice Age. What were the consequences? Well, we have the historical record from Europe, and the record is really echoed in ice core samples. The ice core samples come from stations, sampling stations like the Law Dome coring station in Antarctica that you can see on the right, where drilling extracts deep ice cores, which actually enable the scientists to recover evidence of atmospheric contents and amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere at certain times. As one goes deeper in the core, of course, one is going deeper in time, and one moves up, obviously, more recently in time. The total decline during this period was 7 to 10 parts per million in global atmospheric, that is, carbon dioxide concentration. Of course, this carbon dioxide is the primary greenhouse gas which concerns most of us today. How much of this was a consequence of natural forcing? Actually, it seems, according to recent studies I'm about to talk about, really supposedly natural causes only accounts for about half of that carbon dioxide decrease that is, again, going on parallel to this historically documented time of the Little Ice Age. And here we see a record. We can see the Law Dome record if you look on the left and that white chart. You see the Law Dome record that's the name, the Law Dome record. It's a coring station in Antarctica. And there's another coring station, the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. And you can see the two records. They follow very close together, and they are viewed as representing the global atmosphere. And you can see the Law Dome seems to have captured this one spike or downward nadir, actually, around 1610, again, the lowest point, the lowest temperature. But that yellow band there is about, again, that 100 years or 110 years of really the worst cold experienced. That was the, again, coldest years and lowest CO2 concentrations. So the hypothesis itself, and this is a gross simplification of it's really, I think the hypothesis was presented in 2010, but the study in 2019, which really amassed enormous amounts of data to support it and amplify it, was this one here you see right underneath in Quaternary Science Reviews, Earth System Impacts of the European Arrival and Great Dying in the Americas after 1492. The lead author was Alexander Coe, who was a graduate student at the University College of London. And it created quite a stir among scientists. And obviously, in the popular media here in the New York Times, you can see covered it. And in their headlines wrote, before global warming, humans caused global cooling, study finds. Well, obviously, they're sort of riffing on the idea of global warming, which we discuss and acknowledge that, okay, humans are a great deal responsible for a great deal of the warming atmosphere. The idea of global cooling is rather novel, so that was picked up here in the bottom. You can see another headline: Little Ice Age caused by death of 55 million indigenous peoples after colonization, a study. And that, I think, really, more than anything, sort of shows a lot of hyperbole um, that the press is typical. The science press, unfortunately, could get carried away with some of these things. Really, the actual paper is a, a lot more conservative in its expression of this and doesn't just simply heap the blame on dying Native Americans, which is really rather unfortunate. The other half, this is the hypothesis really. The other half of atmospheric uptake of carbon dioxide was caused by, indirectly here first, by the large scale, that is more than 90% depopulation of the Americas after AD 1492 when Columbus arrived. And that was the European arrival and what happened consequently. That was the abandonment of native lands used for settlement, agriculture, and herding, as basically the area was uh, disrupted in terms of human settlement, and epidemics it really swept over the lands and ended up in a huge number of mortality we'll get to in a moment here. Consequently, reforestation and recovery of formerly cleared landscapes began to occur. 3.5 parts per million of carbon dioxide were then sequestered. That it would be the uptake during the 100 years owed to, again, this restored vegetation from formerly cleared landscapes. When I say sequestration, that means trees which basically draw in carbon dioxide, do so, and where do they draw it from? They draw it during photosynthesis from the atmosphere. So they're actually reducing greenhouse gas, or just really carbon dioxide during this period. So what is this great dying? It really is a very tragic time in American history, or really European American history, of colonization. Here you see two portraits above. I guess there's a sort of a standard posture that conquistadors, or people who arrive and conquer and claim, take, and one foot in front of the other, they plant a flag. Um, Perhaps the one is modeled on the other. I don't know. On the right, actually, an Aztec picture of a person who apparently has measles or probably smallpox. That was drawn by an Aztec artist. So the post-1492, really what anthropologists have been calling this, not the Great Dying, we've been calling it really the demographic collapse in the Americas. Doesn't matter what you want to call it. The Great Dying definitely it draws in an element of hyperbole. The original population is estimated, and I do mean estimated because the numbers fluctuate wildly, because it's hard to know. In 1492, well, no one started counting. So things have had to be reconstructed retrospectively. 60.5 million people were reduced, 90 to 95%. And that is pretty much the agreed upon percentage of reduction that demographers and people who studied this problem come up with. An incredible loss of human life. Why? European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, yellow fever, eventually malaria, a whole host of diseases, chicken pox, which we don't even think of as fatal, the flu, of course, influenza, enslavement, abuse, and downright genocide by colonizers, various nations, conscription of Native American warriors. Certainly the French and Indian War was such a war, and actually many Native American tribes fought along Pizarro against the Incas because they were still rebelling against the Inca Empire. And they suffered a great deal of loss of life during those uh, European adventures as well. Famine and starvation resulted as fields were abandoned. Ecologists use the term cascade effect to describe such a process of accumulating disasters. Well, what is the evidence from the Amazon basin? This was the question that we took up because this is where we've been focusing our work. And I'm, of course, an anthropologist. I've been doing a lot of documentary research and working with paleoecologists. And why is the Amazon important? Well, after all, the Amazon is the New World's greatest forest, and the consumer, it really, perhaps, certainly one of the lungs of the world. It's been, the forests are called the Amazon Basin. And it is also the greatest consumer of carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, as it is being deforested, it is consuming less. That means more is going up into the atmosphere as it is deforested, burned, and lost. In the year 2007, I was doing archaeological fieldwork in the high tropical cloud forests of Peru's eastern Andes. During pre-Hispanic times, this challenging environment was densely inhabited, but it was clear that periodic climate shifts had profound effects on human populations and cultural developments. So, I began conversations with paleoecologist Dr. Mark Bush of the Florida Institute of Technology, who was working in the same region. That white dot that you can see on the lake is Dr. Bush. He's on a raft with a team taking core samples of sediments from the bottom of Lake Chengali. With the layers of organic and mineral remains in the samples, his team identifies environmental changes during past centuries and millennia. His sediment samples often yielded charcoal, pollen from cultivated maize, and intrusive weed species, and other evidence of human landscape modifications. We both saw the benefits of collaboration between our disciplines, and we collaborated for the present study. Mark Bush and a group of other scholars and I decided that it would be a great idea to test the great dying, and or at least this is what I call it, the great dying and little ice age hypothesis that you just saw presented, and use paleoecological and anthropological data from the Amazon basin to test it, at least to the degree we could. So the paleoecological team, which deserves stardom and recognition, is led by Dr. Mark Bush of Florida Tech and Dr. Crystal McMichael at the University of Amsterdam, and there is another illustrious group of scholars that are also involved in this. And here you see great pictures of them. There's Mark on the upper right, there's Crystal in the middle, there is the group coring on the lower right, looking like they're raising the flag at Iwo Jima. And they're all making different kinds of samples. On the left, at the lower part of your screen, you can see the Amazon basin, which is something like 6 to 8 million square kilometers, the size approximately at least the width of the lower 48 states, United States. In other words, if you drove to San Francisco to New York, it would be pretty much about the same distance down the Amazon from close to the headwaters down to the Atlantic Ocean at the mouth. Amazon basin in 1492, what did it look like in terms of human populations? We'll never really exactly know, and that's pretty obvious. And the best we can do is estimate. There is scant information and a great deal of controversy, just because it has been argued for a long time that the Amazon basin, the soils, the conditions for agriculture are simply inadequate to sustain a large population. So what was there? What were the resources? Could it have been El Dorado? Is it a paradise lost? Was it once with a booming population, as a little bit of information or evidence suggests? Or has it always been green hell, which has been the evidence really that has emerged after development projects in the 19th century and 20th century that tried to essentially uh, conduct extensive and intensive agriculture? Every one of them failed spectacularly. So, did it have such low agricultural potential that it was actually a counterfeit paradise? In other words, all that green, lush vegetation was actually a lure that brought you down thinking that you were just going to grow anything down there, yet you failed. And really, only a lot of scientific research has figured out why. And the failure is due to a lot of different environmental conditions. But anyway, today there are relatively low populations in the entire basin, and most of those are grouped along the rivers. How about the early colonization and exploration? Can that give us a clue as to the earliest population numbers? And it's good to think about, because it plays in later, who had rights to which part of the continent. Spain had rights to the northwest and Pacific coast of South America. Portugal had rights to the Atlantic coast, and you can see where the line is there. That dotted line is from the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, and it was a declaration of the Pope, a papal bull, as they call it. You can see that the English, the Dutch, the French, they were all there. And you also notice, and this is a particular interest, that the Portuguese did not really have access to anything but the very delta of the Amazon basin. That was to change, as we will also see. How about the evidence for pre-Columbian populations in this vast region from, say, archaeological evidence? Well, it's a bit ambiguous, but the recent story has changed. One of the problems is poor preservation of archaeological remains, whether artifacts or architectural remains. They're not building with stone in most of these places, which lack stone. The Amazon basin is primarily it's a sedimentary soil environment. And so you simply will not find many outcrops of stone that could be worked into stone tools that are actually available. And a lot of the other kinds of artifacts that they used were created from perishable materials, whether wood or animal, different kinds of organic things, which just simply disintegrated. The earliest explored documents are another source of information, but they are flawed, generally speaking. And it's been my job that what you're wondering, okay, what have I been doing in all this? I've been analyzing these documents and trying to figure out, okay, does the evidence really align between the Little Ice Age and what we know now as the demographic collapse in the Amazon basin? Because it seems to be very important to their argument, the one that I have described. So, I should point out that the archaeological narrative has changed quite a bit. Since 1990, archaeologists have been finding indirect evidence of very large populations along the rivers, especially. In particular, a lot of publicity actually has been given to what has been called traditionally terra preta, or black soil, rich modified soils, rich with charcoal and different kinds of organic materials, which create a great fertile bed for different kinds of agriculture. whether they were, since they are extensive, whether they were used all at the same time or whether they were used periodically is an open question, perhaps. But there are also large platform mounds, village ring mounds, expansive raised field systems in what are seasonally inundated areas, evidence of tended forest orchards that first looked like just simply rainforest until people began to examine the different species represented and realized that they were actually, many of them, planted. And these had been tended orchards. The amounts really, all of this evidence amounts to a view of sustainable subsistence systems. And this is something that is, again, within the last, say, 30 years, we've only begun to understand and only begun to study. So there is now a new narrative of dense populations and perhaps 10 to 20 million. And that's a lot more than were previously thought to have been living in that area. So, of course, this was all, of course, a population that was presumed to have collapsed by 1600. And that's argued in this article by Dr. Koch, Alexander Koch, and his colleagues. And how did it collapse? Disease primarily, slaving, demographic displacements, including different kinds of intertribal conflict. All of these things contributed to really what was a disaster, really a demographic collapse. The first account we have, if we want to look at these accounts, and they are worth looking at, a lot of them are a bit sketchy, but they are worth looking at. The Amazon basin was first explored, in some senses by accident, in 1541. The earliest historical records from the search for El Dorado. First of all, we have eyewitnesses from Gonzalo Pizarro, that's the brother of Francisco Pizarro, and Francisco de Orellana, who was really the lieutenant or second in command of the expedition, and they left to seek El Dorado from Quito, Ecuador. Is the account credible? It is a fascinating account. Pizarro and Orellana became separated because they ended up really starving and having no food, basically killing dogs and horses to sustain themselves, ultimately boiling leather and consuming the kinds of broth you can get out of that. And virtually all of the natives that were porters died on this expedition, of course, except the most perhaps important. The group separated when Pizarro said to Orellana, you go and travel several days down, and if you don't find anything, come back and we'll all march back to Quito. Well, Orellana went down several days and at a certain point decided, got his group together and decided, look, there's no pointing. The group decided that they weren't going to go back. Nobody wanted to. They were all weak. They were all hungry. Nobody was going to march back uphill. So they decided, all right, let's float. And so the group continued. And there is a report written by Gaspar de Carvajal. And the report is fabulous, if you want to believe it all. The riverbanks were lined with urban kingdoms. Ultimately, they found, of course, lots of food. They apparently witnessed large cities and roads. They were attacked constantly by canoes, manned by thousands of warriors. They saw flocks of llamas, if you can believe that, and encountered the famous tribe of women warriors. These are the famous Amazons on the Amazon River. This account was first discredited as wild exaggeration, but it's now being reconsidered. You can see the root of the expedition on the lower left. On the lower right, you can also see an artist's depiction of the Amazon warriors. Apparently, again, these are women who are fierce warriors, and they use men to procreate. And when not using them for procreation, apparently, maybe hang them upside down for target practice. Best I can make out of that picture. Okay, the next trip, again, largely discredited, just too much exaggeration. This has been the conventional wisdom up until relatively recently, when we've thought that perhaps there are some grains of truth, at least in terms of the population numbers. In 1560, the next group goes down, which leaves at least a little bit of an account of their travels. And that was Pedro de Ursua. This is the expedition. Also, it sought El Dorado, and the expedition was hijacked by a madman, Lope de Aguirre, who referred to himself as the wrath of God and traitor and a number of other things. A great little sketch of him looking very evil. So evil that, of course, he captured the imagination of Werner Herzog, who made a movie out of basically the whole adventure, conflating many stories. It's not really completely accurate historically, but the movie is called Aguirre, The Wrath of God, and it's fun to watch if you ever get a chance to rent it. So the journey, anyway, was a chaotic failure. And it might have been even without Lope de Aguirre, but the bottom line is that Aguirre murdered Ursua and many others on the way down. He was a master manipulator of men and soldiers. The accounts lack details, but they did encounter substantial villages. The expedition may have turned up north up the Rio Negro to Venezuela, but the details on the lower part are just too vague to really be sure. Ultimately, Aguirre was shot by his own men in Venezuela. An extremely abusive tale, and Aguirre is, of course, one of the most colorful characters in South American history. Now, the next time we hear about the Amazon Basin from any kind of account is about 1636, and this is when the Portuguese really made a great effort to seize the central and lower Amazon Basin. In 1636, Pedro Teixeira leads an expedition up the Amazon from the Atlantic coast to Quito, Ecuador. He did this with 72 canoes and paddlers, which were natives and African slaves in combination, and working, obviously, over time up the currents of the Amazon. And he claimed lands for Portugal almost at the base of the Andes. He was seeking to expand the slave trade, and ultimately ended up climbing the Andes to Quito, Ecuador, where he was received with great surprise, but nonetheless some hospitality. Well, everybody in Quito was thinking about this. News went to Lima. The Spanish were alarmed, simply that the Portuguese had been at their doorstep when the Treaty of Tordesillas really suggested they were claiming territory to which they had no rights. But the Spanish authorities decided to mount an expedition downriver with Teixeira to return him, after all. And it was led by a priest, a Jesuit priest named Cristobal de Acuna. Acuna he really provided a detailed report of natives and customs, and described the whole basin as a productive and bountiful land. He described the populations as prodigious in number, belonging to over 150 distinct provinces and nations, all with different languages. In other words, brimming with people. At the same time, a report came out from Benito de Acosta, who was a river pilot who was plying the rivers of the Amazon and described, especially for Teixeira, and described dense native populations, and was quoted as saying, all this river of the Amazon on the islands, on the shores, and in the land, inside, it is populated by Indians, and so many in number that if from the air there were to fall a needle, it must hit the head of an Indian and not the ground. A lot of people. Okay, the next time we hear about the Amazon basin from a reliable account is in 1743. Now, we've really moved through time with very little information. That doesn't mean the region was empty. It means that it was full of all sorts of people who were simply not writing accounts and leaving information for people like me to take a look at, and many others, obviously. But in 1743, that is over a century after Acuna, naturalist Charles Marie de la Condamine, sorry, I don't speak French, descended from the Andes and created the first accurate map of the river course. De la Condamine either really was too little interested in the native populations that he witnessed, or there were just too few to attract his attention. The intervening century then, following 1620, in the central Amazon basin was characterized then between at least these travels of Teixeira and Acuna, and then later by Condamine, were characterized by expanded mission. This we know of from many other documents. Expanded missionary activity, a violent and relentless slaving initiative by the Portuguese, who now controlled the region, which was to later become modern Brazil, and waves of epidemics, which were introduced by the accelerated influx of outsiders. And many of those are also documented by disease and date. So, the century and decades following 1620 of the Christian era were the time of the Great Dying in the central Amazon basin. What does that mean for us? Okay, revisiting this hypothesis, this Little Ice Age Great Dying hypothesis, what did Orellana really see on that first expedition in 1541? We don't know, and never will. He died basically at the mouth of the Amazon, and a few chroniclers who simply handed in reports. Nothing was heard from them again. What was the native population of the Amazon basin in 1492? Again, we can only estimate. Do the dates of the Little Ice, this is the important one, do the dates of the Little Ice Age match the dates of the Great Dying and consequent landscape abandonment and sequestration of CO2 during biomass recovery? Evidently, no, it really could not have happened. The demographic collapse in the central Amazon began too late to have played a major role in the exacerbation of the Little Ice Age. So, after all, I did lead you down this path. What does the paleoecological record of landscape abandonment indicate? I have to say, stay tuned for the answer. And so here we are, at least to just wonder, oh, okay, you're not going to answer at least the central question, what's the takeaway from all this? I have to say that I, again, am not at liberty to tell you about the paleoecological research conclusions, but my preliminary research submitted for publication as a co-author suggests that the timing of the Little Ice Age and the Great Dying, at least in Amazonia, and Amazonia is the greatest CO2 sink in the Americas, is entirely out of sync. The timing does not work. You can see that the Little Ice Age really, in terms of the great downward spike, happened well prior to what is the Great Dying in the Amazon basin. This presents a problem for the 2019 proposal. So, the takeaway: the causes of the Little Ice Age will likely require further research. Thank you so much for tuning in. Another takeaway, just I thought I'd add: plant a tree. Thank you.